How far would you go to achieve your goals? How many people would you sacrifice to further your own selfish ambitions? Would you even trade the life of your own child to obtain greater power? For the only woman to ever sit on the Chinese imperial throne in over 3,000 years of history, such questions were easy to answer. She would do whatever it takes to win. The woman who would become Empress Wu Zetian was prepared to carry out whatever act, no matter how ruthless or abhorrent, in her quest for ever greater power and influence. Her long and bloody ascension, littered with the corpses of her enemies, and even members of her own family, her name forever tainted by murder, deceit, and unimaginable cruelty. This obsessive pursuit of ambition, even driving her to sacrifice her own infant child, in a disturbing example of how the desire for power can utterly corrupt the human soul. Little is known about Wu Zetian's early life. However, she is believed to have been born in 624 AD to a relatively wealthy but minor family. What seems to have set the young girl apart from other women at the time was her father's insistence on providing her with an education, a decision which set her on a path that would lead to the very heights of power. Encouraged to develop her intellect and obtain knowledge that was usually the domain of men, Wu was equipped from an early age with all of the skills required to outthink, outmaneuver, and charm potential rivals and allies. At 14 years of age, she was taken to the imperial palace as a junior concubine of Emperor Taizong, a position considered to be a great honor at the time, and one that hints at her beauty, for only the most attractive women in China were admitted to the ranks of palace concubines. Yet physical attractiveness alone would not be enough to elevate a woman who held a minor rank, which essentially saw her serving as a glorified maid. Wu's main hope at advancement lay in gaining the affection and favor of the emperor. However, with dozens of other beautiful, charismatic, and ambitious women vying for his attention, rising above her allotted station would also require an impressive level of intelligence, determination, and sheer luck. One of Wu's main advantages over the other concubines could be found in the minor role she held. As an imperial maid, her duties included changing the emperor's bed sheets, a task that gave her unsupervised access to Emperor Taizong's private bedchamber, access which she is rumored to have utilized to full effect, with many Chinese historians suggesting that she first rose to prominence thanks to her willingness to satisfy the emperor's more unusual desires. Regardless of what might have gone on behind closed doors, her advancement was also fueled by the education her father had insisted she receive, the emperor soon finding himself infatuated by this young concubine who not only possessed extreme beauty, but also a keen mind and sharp wit. Impressed and entranced by Wu's unusual characteristics, the emperor quickly promoted his new favorite concubine, making her his personal secretary, a position that gave her access to and involvement in the affairs of state at the very highest level, invaluable experience which was not wasted on the ambitious young woman who hungrily familiarized herself with the intricate political machinery of the imperial court. Yet, just as it seemed as though her path to greatness was secure, calamity struck when the emperor suddenly died, a turn of events which threatened to crush Wu's ambitions and cast her into historical obscurity. According to ancient customs, all concubines of a deceased emperor were expected to have their heads shaved and serve out the remainder of their lives in chastity as nuns, living in a remote temple, since the prospect of them laying with another man was seen as a grave insult to the departed emperor, who jealously guarded his women even in the afterlife. Wu was sent away to Garnier Temple, however it seems as though she had anticipated this turn of events and already secured the affections of the late emperor's son and successor, the new emperor Gaozong, who scandalously violated tradition by bringing Wu back to the palace and making her one of his own concubines, a move fueled by lust and desire, which is likely to have raised eyebrows amongst his court. However, as emperor, Gaozong could do as he pleased. This unusual breakout from the nunnery suggests that the pair had already been having an affair while the new emperor's father was still alive, a dangerous liaison that could have cost Wu her head, but one that ultimately saved her from a life imprisoned in a nunnery and saw her returned to the imperial palace where she was convinced that she belonged. Yet upon her return to the palace, Wu was faced with a powerful and dangerous rival in the form of the emperor's existing senior wife, Empress Wang, a woman who took an immediate dislike to Wu and no doubt sensed the potential threat posed by her husband's charming, much younger, and beautiful new concubine. Empress Wang became increasingly jealous of the attention the emperor lavished upon Wu, and when Wu gave the emperor 2 sons in 652 and the next year in 653, the sonless Empress Wang no doubt sensed her influence steadily slipping away. While Wu's 2 sons were not in line for the throne, and thus no immediate threat, the simmering resentment of Empress Wang represented a clear and present danger that was simply too great to ignore. Wu knew that she had to act decisively to remove this threat to her position and barrier to further advancement, once and for all. In 654, Wu bore the emperor a daughter, however the infant baby soon died under mysterious circumstances shortly after her birth. While the exact circumstances behind the infant's death can never be known for certain, what is known is at whose feet blame for the death fell. A distraught Wu accused Empress Wang of murdering her baby in a fit of jealousy, and when evidence of deliberate strangulation was discovered on the infant's corpse, coupled with eyewitness testimony that placed Empress Wang as being the last person to visit the baby, the furious emperor demoted and imprisoned Wang in a remote wing of the palace while he contemplated her fate. As though the tale were not tragic enough, many historians suspect that Wu was behind the baby's death, intentionally strangling her own infant daughter as part of an elaborate plot to frame Empress Wang for murder, and thus eliminate a powerful and persistent rival, clearing her path and ensuring that no others stood between her and the emperor's side. The attention and affection of the most powerful man in China was to be hers and hers alone. It's also possible that the baby died of natural causes, and that Wu simply took advantage of the tragedy to eliminate her enemy. However, regardless of which explanation was true, the end result was the permanent removal of Empress Wang from power. Just days after the baby's death, Wu became Emperor Gaozong's highest-ranking wife, and thus the new empress consort, while her son Li Hong was granted the title of Crown Prince and heir apparent of the empire. As the second most powerful person in the palace and mother of the next emperor, Empress Wu swiftly moved against all those she deemed to be a potential threat, purging the palace of old enemies, along with anyone who had ever dared to speak against her, no matter how minor the perceived slight, promoting family members and staunch allies in their place, until the entire apparatus of government was essentially under her sole control. With her political rivals eliminated and the emperor's sole affections now secured, Empress Wu quickly moved to destroy the imprisoned Lady Wang once and for all, lest the accused woman somehow worm her way back into the emperor's graces. The manner in which she disposed of the former empress consort may be an exaggeration of the truth or even an outright lie, however, if true, is a testament to just how ruthless and vindictive she could be when dealing with those who had dared to threaten her own power and position. Wu is said to have ordered Lady Wang's hands and feet to be chopped off before throwing her into a vat of wine, the helpless woman rendered unable to stand up and thus slowly drowning under the wine's surface as Wu watched on with grim satisfaction. In the years that followed, Empress Wu continued to consolidate her power, acting as the true power behind the throne by manipulating her husband's weakness, indecisiveness, and naivety, a state of affairs which was only strengthened by Emperor Gaozong's debilitating stroke in 660 AD, an event which resulted in Empress Wu becoming the administrator of the court, a position which officially recognized her as the sole person with the authority to speak on behalf of the emperor himself. A sickly Emperor Gaozong consulted Wu on all matters before making a decision, often allowing her to act independently without consulting him, the majority of his state responsibilities now fully delegated to Empress Wu, who accepted her ever-increasing responsibilities with glee. Now effectively equal in rank to the Emperor himself, Empress Wu is said to have taken revenge on the Palace Old Guard, a group of elder statesmen with great influence and power who had served the previous emperor and staunchly opposed Wu's elevation through the ranks, on the grounds that she had been a concubine of the former emperor, effectively making her current relationship with Emperor Gaozong incestuous, rendering her entirely unfit to serve in such an exalted position. With so much power concentrated in her hands, even such well-respected and influential political veterans could not withstand the iron will of the Empress, the woman who had started out as a lowly concubine, dismissing, exiling, or executing all opponents who had stood in her way. Even the Emperor's own flesh and blood were not safe from Wu's wrath, with his uncle, a man of imperial descent himself, sentenced to death while other relatives were exiled and financially ruined. Yet, despite unleashing such a reign of terror on her opponents, Empress Wu is said to have governed with impressive efficiency, promoting highly competent men to important government posts, and inspiring a great degree of loyalty in her followers, many of whom both respected her courage and willingness to make tough choices in the name of stable governance, while also fearing her potential wrath and vengeance should they ever disappoint her, in a perfect example of how it's truly better to be feared and respected than loved. By the time Emperor Gaozong finally died, some 20 years after she had been made empress, Wu was already the ultimate power in China. Her subsequent appointment as Empress Dowager and regent for her young son now merely a formality. All were fully aware in whose hands true authority lay. Yet although her son was technically the emperor, Wu jealously guarded her control over the levers of power, even from her own child, refusing to allow her son to play any significant role in the affairs of state, and even deposing him in favour of her youngest son just 6 weeks into his reign, after his new wife persuaded him to try and assert his own authority and go against his mother's wishes. The younger son proved to be far more compliant, willing to allow Wu to act in his stead, content to hold authority in name only. However, the removal of a legally appointed sitting emperor just 6 weeks into his reign had not gone unnoticed. A small revolt broke out in response to Empress Wu's highly irregular move. However, the swift, decisive and ruthless manner in which it was crushed demonstrated just how unbreakable the Empress's position was, no doubt quelling any further dissent that might have been bubbling under the surface. Even the most foolhardy potential rebel now realized just how pointless it would be to test the iron will of Empress Wu. However, even her more obedient youngest son could not escape his mother's unquenchable thirst for power. Tired of manipulating lesser men to achieve her goals, Empress Wu decided to seize the throne for herself, forcing her son to abdicate and declaring herself sole Empress of China, the first and last woman to ever hold this position. No more would she share the spotlight and govern from the shadows through a male emperor. The throne was hers and hers alone. Wu had risen from low-ranking concubine to undisputed empress of one of the largest, richest, oldest and most powerful empires in human history. However, just as remarkable as her rise to power was the sheer ruthlessness with which she achieved her ascension. Rivals were liquidated without mercy, even when they were relatives by blood, with grandchildren, sisters, brothers, nieces and nephews poisoned, executed and forced to commit suicide. Even her own children fell victim to her machinations. 2 sons were removed from power by her hand, and if the legend is true, the chilling and cold-hearted way in which she disposed of her own newborn daughter as part of a scheme to rid herself of an enemy speaks of an almost psychopathic and paranoid pursuit of power. Real and imagined enemies met the same fate, and like most autocrats, as her own power increased, so too did the perceived threats against her, the empress who governed millions, seeing enemies hiding in every shadow. With an army of spies and informants working for her, ordinary citizens were encouraged to report on their friends, family, and neighbours, and rewarded for doing so, such that any plot or even a mere whisper of treason could be detected and swiftly punished. And it was said that at the height of her power, not a single person would dare to publicly criticise the Empress for fear of being discovered, for all knew the fate that awaited such heresy. Yet while her supposed reign of terror might seem to be excessive in its cruelty and paranoia, the actions of Empress Wu were not all that different from any other monarch at the time. Rulers throughout history gained and maintained power through violence and fear, almost without exception. In a world where violence was the ultimate form of authority, soft, kind-hearted people simply could not rise to such prominence or stay there. The very nature of power meant that any display of weakness by a ruler would almost certainly be exploited by those who had no such qualms about inflicting suffering upon others, and were willing to do whatever it took to gain and hold power. The meek would always be deposed by the ruthless. This double standard in how Empress Wu seems to have been singled out by history as being especially vicious is likely down to the disapproval of historians at the time. While Wu almost certainly did kill her enemies, including members of her own family, promoted loyalists to high office, and maintain her own harem of young men, such actions were considered ordinary for, and indeed expected by, any male emperor throughout the imperial age. Another issue with the account of her reign is its accuracy. The few surviving records that detail Wu's rise to power are highly biased, penned by scholars who disapproved of usurpers, especially female ones, or by relatives and victims who suffered at her hand and thus had good cause to despise her. The temptation for such people to unfairly malign the Empress would have likely been too great to ignore. Although her path to the imperial throne was littered with the corpses of her enemies, her time in power was remarkably peaceful and prosperous. Empress Wu introduced meritocratic entrance examinations for the imperial bureaucracy, largely avoided costly wars, cut taxes, improved living standards, and reduced corruption. Her 40 years occupying the heights of power, bringing great stability to the empire, perhaps somewhat as a byproduct of her ruthless intolerance for any dissent or challenge to her authority. Yet despite achieving her lofty ambitions and overcoming the tremendous odds stacked against her, ironically, like so many of the powerful men she replaced, it would be base desires of the flesh that proved to be her downfall. After becoming infatuated by two young brothers, Empress Wu, who was now in her 80s, began spending less time attending to matters of state and more time in the company of her lovers, while at the same time her physical health and mental cognition began to rapidly decline, her mind and body slowly succumbing to the ravages of age. Sensing her growing weakness, the palace officials who for so long had been restrained by fear began to move against her, a vast conspiracy forming which resulted in Wu's once unbreakable base of support dissolving beneath her. A coalition of powerful ministers and generals seized control of the palace, put Wu's lovers to death, and forced the elderly empress to abdicate in favour of her exiled son, the former Emperor Zhongzong, whom she had usurped many years before. Faced with either surrendering the throne or enduring a humiliating exile or even execution, Empress Wu agreed and relinquished her power, dying just a year later. The woman who had spent her entire life in the pursuit of power and sacrificed so much and so many to achieve it, ultimately losing everything through a heady mix of age, complacency, and temptation. The eventual betrayal she suffered at the hands of those once deemed loyal, perhaps proving her right all along. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.